Okay, so at this point in the video, we're going to actually get to tackle a real test question. So we're going to go through the steps the way that we would on test day with this question. And we're not actually going to write the whole essay. It wouldn't be useful, but we are going to go through all the steps that you would go through. So, in some high schools, students are required to complete a certain number of community service hours prior to graduation. Some people think community service is a good requirement because they think students will benefit from this experience. Other people think schools should not require community service because students will resent the requirement and, as a result, will not benefit from the experience. In your opinion, should high schools require students to complete a certain number of hours of community service? Now that is the first paragraph, and that's where the actual arguments are being set up. The second paragraph are the instructions, and that is what you guys are going to know really, really well, so you don't have to read it on test day. However, you guys probably don't know it yet, which is totally understandable, so I will read them. In your essay, take a position on this question. You may write about either one of the 2 points of view given, or you may present a different point of view on this question. Use specific reasons to support your position. Okay, great. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to kind of look at our prompt. So we've read it, and the next thing is you want to make sure that you understand it. So if you're thinking about this, you wouldn't have to write it down necessarily, but your main idea is community service, and specifically mandatory community service. So your 3 options are that, it's a good thing, it should be required, it should not be required, or the third option, which is you kind of pick your own argument. For this sort of essay, there's a lot of different kind of pick your own argument ideas, but they have to have, be something related to community service. So for instance, you could say community service hours should not be mandatory, but teachers should be required to offer at least 2% extra credit bonus for doing a certain number of community service hours. So it's voluntary, but there's a good incentive to do it. Or community service should not be mandatory, but you earn your right to be involved in school clubs through doing community service. Or you don't have to do community service, you could either do community service or do an internship, for instance, arguing that you don't really have time to do both, and it might be more interesting or more important for you to do an internship. There's a lot of different things that you could argue in that topic. But since the third pick your argument is going to be super personal to everybody, we're not going to dwell on it too much. The idea, though, is that if you're going to do a pick your own argument, you want to still be really specific about what things are good about community service and which things are bad. So by covering it should be required and it should not be required, you actually are covering pretty much any pick your own argument that you could come up with. So the idea is you pick one of your 3 options. The option that you pick does not have to be the one you actually agree with. Normally, I would not say that, but in terms of a standardized test essay, you're being timed, so you really need to just pick the thing that you can support the best. So when you're reading this, if you immediately think, oh wow, I've got 3 amazing examples for it should not be required, but personally, I really think it should be required. Well, unless you can come up with 3 equally amazing examples, you should just argue the thing that you've got the examples for already. So the idea is you pick examples. So normally you would just pick one side and then deal with examples for it, but I'm going to go ahead and write down both so that everybody can follow along, and no matter what view you want to take, there's examples for both. So I've got it split up into required and not required. If you tend to be a person who has problems coming up with examples, which is really, really normal. Most people have this problem. There's an easy trick that I like to use for it. So the idea is you sit down and you think, what is the purpose of, in this case, school? So what is the purpose of school? Anything that a school does should be furthering its purpose. Generally, when you think of the purpose of school, the first thing you're probably going to think of is education or like intellectual development or growth of some sort. But that's not the only thing that school does. So in addition to, intellectual growth or fostering knowledge, giving you a good education, school is also partially a social institution, and that's actually important. It's the part of school that you probably enjoy maybe the most, but don't think about as much. The next thing that school does is it prepares you for the real world. Now, it really depends on what you're going to do in terms of how it's going to prepare you for that, but generally what falls under this category is college, so higher education or future jobs. Now, there are other things that school does as well. Depending on what kind of school you go to, there might be a spiritual aspect to the school, and if that's true for you, then please feel free to use that as well. In fact, in this essay, that would work really well. And if you can come up with other reasons that, you think schools exist, that's great. I tend to think that the three that I have are kind of easy to tie into pretty much every essay. So there's a lot more that there's a lot of other things you could say in terms of what is the purpose of school. But these three, the sort of knowledge / intellectual growth, social growth, and then preparing you for the real world, those will apply to virtually every essay you're ever going to have to write. Very occasionally, you will have a non-school related essay, and then you're going to do the same thing. You're going to say, what is the purpose of insert main topic? So, what is the purpose of school? These three things. So, if we're having a hard time coming up with examples, we could find an example that has to do with education or intellectual growth, one that's about social growth, and one that's preparing you for the real world. If you can come up with examples that don't fall into those categories, that's great too. This is just a little way of helping you guys come up with examples. So in terms of saying, okay, community service should be required, there's a lot of great things that you could say. So an easy one here would be if you pick any hospital that has a community service program associated with it. And if somebody is interested in becoming a doctor or a nurse, the best thing that they can do is go and volunteer at a hospital or at a doctor's office and at least get a real life idea of what it means to be a doctor, what it means to be a nurse. And you probably have all met at least one person at some point who wanted to be a doctor and then realized that they don't like the sight of blood. A lot of people don't figure that out until they're already halfway through college. And if you can figure that out in high school, then you can develop other things that you might be more happy with later on in life. So it's really important to do community service in terms of learning what you want to do. And it exposes you to jobs, and some of them you will weed out. And you might actually find the thing that you really want to do for the rest of your life by doing community service. So you would pick a specific charity or a specific instance in which a friend went to said charity or you went to a charity, and you would delve into the benefits. Okay, now let's look at the sorts of things you could talk about for not required. So we're going to talk about negative impacts of doing community service. So the one that they gave you in the prompt is that people will, if they're made to do community service, they might resent it. So that would make you less likely to do community service in the future. And, therefore sort of a less, I guess, aware less aware person in a way. So you have that, and you could definitely talk about that. You would just want to add in a little bit of specifics to that. So you could take a really bad community service experience that you had, for instance, or you could talk about certain kinds of charities that most high school students would not really have, a benefit from working at. So, for instance, let's say that you know of a place that has a cadaver lab, let's say. So, be that a medical school or a symposium on facelifts, etc. But somewhere where there will be human cadavers. Okay, some students will actually get a really positive experience out of seeing how the body works. Some students are going to be a little bit scarred by that experience and probably not want to go back ever again. So it could potentially be a really scarring experience to do community service. Now the problem is with the not required side of this essay is that you have to make the point for not requiring community service at any specific place. So if you're going to say that, some community service opportunities are negative, you have to make it sound like there's enough negative opportunities that it's hard to find a good one, and you're going to have to go through several negative opportunities before finding a positive one, and the act of going through the negative ones forces you to give up. So a good example of that would be if you have a school that requires certain, like community service at certain charities, aka they're trying to keep track of it really well, and you happen to live really far away from your school, and all those charities are near your school. That has a negative impact on you and potentially your parents if they're driving you, and it would make you resent having to do the community service. So if there's some sort of situation that would make it especially negative, explain that, because that makes the essay stronger. You could also talk about the time involved. So if you happen to be, let's say, a really, really, really good tennis player, and nowhere around you is there a tennis-related service opportunity, aka, teaching little kids tennis. And you are so good at tennis that you could go pro. If your school tells you you have to do a ton of community service, you might just simply not have the time to do it. And therefore being forced to do it is detrimental to your future career as a tennis pro. You could also talk about the fact that if somebody forces you to do something, it kind of takes away the enjoyment or the point. So you do community service because you want to help other people, generally. There are other reasons to do it, but that tends to be kind of the number one obvious answer to the question, why do you do community service? So if you now have to do community service because somebody told you to, it gets rid of the point. So as long as you can come up with a specific instance in which that happened, then that could be a good example. So the idea is that I put bullet points down of the sorts of things that you could talk about, but you want to have specific examples of any of the things that you're going to use. And once you have all of those examples, you would write your thesis and then go ahead and start writing. And again, like I said, once you start writing, just keep going unless there's something really obvious you want to fix at that time. And then about 2 to 3 minutes before they call time, you want to make sure that you get to have a chance to proofread everything. But the most important thing is actually these first 5 minutes, because it ensures that you have good examples, you have a good thesis, and you have a clear direction of where you're headed in your essay. And just a few more notes on examples. They can be personal examples. In fact, especially all of the school-related prompts lend themselves really well to personal examples, but they can be from books, they can be from history. You can pretty much draw from any source you want to as long as you are specific and your examples are relevant. So for this sort of essay, you could talk about any novel in which there is some sort of service aspect, or actually any novel in which someone is forced to do something that they don't want to do. And if that's a positive experience, that could be a good example for your it should be required. And if it's a negative experience, it could be for your it's not required or it should not be required. You also can make up examples. However, a note on made up examples, they have to be specific. So any human being that you make up needs to have a name, and they need to have either a title or a relationship to you. So what that means is talking about Joe is not okay. Talking about your best friend Joe is fine, because that sounds like a real person. You also can make up things more complicated than just, personal friends. You can talk about studies, for instance, but if you're going to make up a study, it better sound like a real study, aka Miller, Hopkins, and Wagner et al. Could be the authors of a study. That sounds completely reasonable. You just have to make sure that if you do feel the need to make something up, that you stay really specific and you keep it within the realm of possibility. So what that means is, don't get too crazy. Make sure that it's something that could happen, that would make complete sense if it happened. And also don't make up major historical events, anything to that nature, because your reader will notice and will not be completely pleased with that. Okay, guys. So with that, you guys should be ready to start practicing writing some essays. So good job. Next step for everyone is to just practice a couple essays, time yourself, and get a feel for, making sure that you're doing the 5-minute plan and prompt, and then saving about 2 to 3 minutes for proofreading at the end. All right, thanks, guys.